92% of households that start the year with Peloton are still active a year later.
92% because of a bike?
Not just bikes. We also make treadmills and rowers.
Oh, let me guess, for elite athletes only, right?
Nope. It doesn't matter if you're an avid exerciser or new to working out. Peloton can help you achieve your fitness goals. 92% stick with it. So can you. Try Peloton bikes, tread, or row risk-free with a 30-day home trial. New members only. Not available in remote locations. See additional terms at onepeloton.com/home-trial.
Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, I'm Carol Fleck, the editor of Attitude Magazine. Welcome to Mental Health Out Loud, a new type of conversation where the editors of Attitude talk with leading experts in the fields of ADHD and mental health about the topics of greatest concern. Today, we're talking about strategies to encourage healthy eating among teens with eating disorders and ADHD. It's part 2 of our conversation on eating disorders, and this one will focus on diet and nutrition. We're asking our experts, Megan Kniskern, a registered dietitian, and Dena Cabrera, a clinical psychologist, the very questions that our readers have asked to get help for families right now. Dena is a clinical psychologist and certified eating disorder specialist with more than 24 years of experience. She has a private practice in Anthem, Arizona, and she has previously served as president of the International Association of Eating Disorders Professionals. Megan is the owner of Mac Nutrition Services. She is a senior lecturer at Arizona State University. In 2021, she launched an online training program for registered dietitians called Deepen Your Perspectives, Nutrition Therapy for Mental Health. Megan works with clients with complex eating disorders and supervises other registered dietitians in the areas of eating disorders, substance use, and mental health nutrition support. She has authored the revised 2020 Eating Disorder Standards of Practice and Standards of Professional Practice. Before we start our conversation, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into this live event may submit questions for Dena and Megan at any time by navigating to the text box under the video player. We will do our best to incorporate your questions into today's conversation. And if you support the work we're doing here at Attitude, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. Subscribe now and you'll receive our winter issue featuring a holiday survival guide to help families with difficult relatives who don't understand ADHD in children. Also, you won't want to miss expert advice on navigating kids' ADHD treatment when they're living with divorced parents in 2 households. The winter issue also features survey results from our readers on their kids' mental health and the answers that just might surprise you. Parents will also want to read about new digital therapies aimed at curbing kids' ADHD symptoms, and there's a smart guide on bonding activities too. So, welcome Dena and Megan, and thank you both for joining Attitude for this very important conversation. In our last conversation, we talked about low self-esteem and other issues that lead to eating disorders in people with ADHD, and we discussed how to identify eating disorders in teens, tweens, and young adults. Now, as we shift our focus, our viewers have asked, how much food should a teen or young adult who is in the throes of or recovering from an eating disorder consume in a day? What are some strategies a parent can use to help their child to eat? And what's the least amount one can eat and still get sufficient nutrition?
Well, that is a wonderful question. I'm so glad to be here today. The first thing that I would want to point out is what are the dynamics and what is kind of the nutrition and food situation happening within the home? Because nowadays, there are lots of different approaches to food. There are lots of different food, I'm going to call them beliefs, food practices. And so in order to determine where the support comes from the most and how to best support that individual, that child, that young adult, it really kind of starts with what's going on in the family dynamics. What is kind of the availability of food? Meaning, do mom and dad both work? Are they in split homes? Do parents cook? Are they eating out often? Do they have caregivers that are around? Are they, hanging with grandparents? We also want to think about, obviously, individual needs. Age is obviously a factor. Typically, we need more energy the older we get, even especially as growing kiddos. And gender can play a role, right? Boys can tend to need a little bit more than girls, but that's not always specific. And then we want to think about activity level. A lot of us, I have an 8 and a 10-year-old, both boys, are in, that time frame where kids are very active. Sports, activities, all those different, they might not even be in a sport, but they could be doing theater. I think of Dena's kids. They could be doing arts. They could be having a whole neighborhood of friends that they play with every single day. There's so much going on. So when we think about the needs of a child in a recovery setting, we have to think about lifestyle, and we need to figure out who are the best people to offer support. I want to also offer, sometimes the dynamics of the home don't really allow the parents to be the most supportive individuals in that situation. There can be a lot of conflict there. And that's where us as professionals, as a team, come in to really offer that support. But if I wanted to give sort of like a minimum, a guideline of like a minimum standard, a lot of the places I start with is there needs to be 3 eating events in the day. So sometimes saying a meal for breakfast will freak a kid out, right? I'm not having breakfast. I need you to have a snack first thing in the morning. So if we need to label it something other than a meal, if we need to call it something else, we can do that. But there need to be 3 eating events happening in the day as a minimum to make sure we're meeting the food needs and standards of just about anybody. But let's talk about kids specifically and young adults. So that's where I would kind of start. And again, I want to make sure that we are reiterating that this does not fall on the families. The expectation that families had that they can fix this, that they've got this under control, that they can love them enough, that they can support them enough. Like, oh, I get it. And I hear that, but that's not how this works. And getting people around you to support the entire dynamic is going to be really critical in helping to combat this sooner and faster, hopefully.
So how does it affect the brain and the body when a teen in particular eats an insufficient amount of food and nutrients? And how should parents talk with their teen about nutrition and its impact on development?
I love this question so much because malnutrition really is a snowball effect. So you start, I'm just going to skip breakfast, right? And I'm not villainizing breakfast. We're just going to keep using it as an example. But like you can just start with, I'm going to skip breakfast. And then you realize you're not eating until lunch. And then it's like, I can go a little bit longer, right? So there becomes a snowball effect. And it's also supported by the fact that the brain starts to malfunction. The body starts to malfunction. Specifically, the GI system and our ability to sleep all start to malfunction. And so that is strongly contributing to the snowball effect. So any time that we find that there is a purposefulness or a concern about quantity of food and meeting an individual's needs, especially during phases of growth, it's something to not be taken lightly. Let's even use the example of a child who may be quote unquote in a larger body, right? Higher ends of the growth curve, maybe falling into some of those medically labeled terms such as overweight percentile wise. Even in that situation, food restriction and limitation should not be encouraged. We want that individual to figure out, why did the change happen? Why is their body behaving differently? Is this behavior oriented or is it something else? And we want them to grow into that body. So there's really never a time where we want to encourage any kind of restriction, limitation, or insufficiency with food. And when we do see that happen, there's really no part of the system that's not impacted. It's just a matter of time before systems start to malfunction for each individual.
And
so I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, Carol. I was going to add that if you look at symptoms related to depression or even anxiety, malnutrition and depression, the symptoms are very similar. So you may see slow cognitive processing, you may see irritability, you probably might see some mood changes. And a lot of people might say, oh, they're anxious or they're depressed. We certainly see a correlation between malnutrition as it relates to restricting and anxiety. We've seen that those who are severely underweight have extremely high anxiety. And it's not because necessarily what some people will judge, well, that's about the food, that's about body image issues, that's about, not wanting to eat. It's actually a physiological response to restriction, to, as far as self-deprivation or deprivation, to anxiety. Anxiety is kind of a motivator to help us get the nutrition or move us forward, impact behavior so that we'll make changes. That's the purpose sometimes of anxiety, feeling that threat to the body. So restriction is certainly related to that. And malnutrition can certainly mimic other clinical, if you will, symptoms. And actually, it's about not getting the sufficient needs as it relates to food.
So can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of how that might manifest in a school day, how it might manifest at school in terms of academic performance, or maybe even participating in social activities? What might that look like? And what are some good warning signs for parents in addition to the anxiety and depression that they might see?
So clinically, I'll start as far as clinically what might happen, and then Megan can jump in, what's happened from a nutritional standpoint. If there's, as we all know, their brains just really aren't online. And Megan can kind of speak, like, if we're not getting kind of that, grain in the morning or glucose in the morning to kind of jumpstart our brain to begin. So they may start, and, if they go by and, get their caffeine, which a lot of kids are drinking these, monster drinks or these red, these caffeinated drinks, we have to be aware of that. And it certainly could impact performance. So they'll start to, really not notice, especially if they're in the habit of it, until, as it gets to be like midday, middle of the day. And then what happens is with hunger and fullness cues, sometimes they may be hungry. And if they ignore those, it's the body, it will shut down. Like their hunger, it's kind of like this sweet spot where if you get past this stage of hunger, sometimes it just kind of shuts off because it's the body's way of surviving, and they won't feel that. So then they've got to lunch, as Megan said earlier, and then they haven't, fueled their body. And oftentimes, particularly with kids who have ADHD, if they ignore those cues, then, or if stimulants are affecting their hunger fullness cues, and we don't have sufficient and consistent nutrition needs throughout the day, we may see slow cognitive processing, lack of energy, lethargic, tired. And then when they get home from school, they may be more irritable, and then maybe like, oh my gosh, I'm really hungry. And they'll eat more of their energy needs towards the day. And that affects the whole circadian rhythm. It affects their schedule, if you will. It could affect their sleep. So there's a lot of complicated factors that may go into it that could affect just their personality, and their general way of getting along with people could be impacted because of irritability. And I'll let Megan kind of speak to that more.
In context to the anxiety, the depressive symptoms, there's kind of an obsessive compulsive component that can show up too, right? So fixation on certain foods, fixation on having foods at certain times, maybe even a little bit more rituals than maybe are typically present around food in particular, or other events in the day. And when we really think about the systems malfunctioning, Dena kind of talked about that hunger. So just because we skip hunger and we ignore it doesn't mean our body doesn't need that fuel anymore. It's, again, like, just because you decide you don't want to go get gas because your low fuel light's on, eventually the car will run out of gas. And so that buildup is something that is not an awareness. And so whether it is, again, the stimulant or the behaviors throughout the day, you're going to notice that inconsistent eating is going to lead to things like an inability to focus on maybe individual work in the classroom, more likely to be talking out, more likely to be distracting others, maybe getting more calls from like reports from the teacher about behaviors, things like that is going to show up. And it doesn't always the reference point isn't ever almost, did I eat enough or did I drink enough water, right? The reference point is just, I feel chaos. And so we do want to make sure that food and fueling becomes a part of a routine in creating structure for that particular plan for that individual. And if that means sticking to comfort foods, and foods that feel more individualistic and easy at that time, sometimes that's what's needed. We want to just make sure the consistency is there over maybe having it look a certain way or be perfect or, have specific balance.
So Dena just touched on this, and we've had quite a few questions about children's eating patterns and about binge eating in particular. We know that for some teens, taking ADHD medication, they might not have much of an appetite during the day, but they become perhaps binge eaters later on in the day or at night as the medication begins to wear off. What approaches do you recommend to address this pattern?
Really, it is working with the individual, the client, the kiddo, and talking to them and saying, okay, what's going on in the morning? If there's a medication, when are we taking the medication? How do we see it working for you throughout the day? And it's having those conversations about the fact that even if you're not hungry and even if food feels unappealing, we live off of that food. So we need to come up with some basic things that you're willing to have, at that non-breakfast meal snack, whatever we call it, in the morning. You're going to have maybe a monitored snack with the school nurse, or a teacher might be, hey, yep, they ate their granola bar. You can do accommodations like that in schools if needed. And then they need to sit with a good group of friends and make sure they eat a lunch. And we don't need to be perfectionistic about that, but creating a routine that works for the family. Who's packing it? Are they buying it at school? What are the ideas? These are the structure that they have to have. And then typically the weekends will look a little different too. Some kids don't maybe take their medication on the weekend, so eating is a little bit easier. Or if they do, parents are there to help guide, or if they have sporting event, right? So the idea is though that even when the lack of desire to eat is there, we have to be kind of parentifying them in a way to learn how to fuel and care for that body. Because as I mentioned, that snowball effect of malnutrition, or the flip side, which is not having enough and then binging, those are better behaviors. Like that's not where we want them to learn how to care for their bodies, even though this is sort of the concession we're making. We're using the stimulant to correct something, but there's a side effect. And the side effect is we need to make sure you're fueling your growing body.
Mm-hmm. Are there certain foods that you might recommend for when they're not feeling particularly hungry?
Yeah, definitely.
During the school day?
100%. I go through like easy to pack, nothing that's going to melt, nothing that has a big smell, things that are disposable easily. I would work with them on what are some of your favorite foods to have at school? What are the kids around you eating? What's going to feel comfortably texturally for you, quantity for you, and have it be successful. For instance, don't overpack their meal and then have them feel really overwhelmed, but you're being a good parent and you're giving them lots of options and you want to make sure they eat, right? Have a conversation and go with it. I have one kiddo, my 10-year-old, will have a granola bar or an Eggo for breakfast. My other one, bacon, the biggest bowl of life cereal you've ever seen, a side of fruit. And like, he's still like, Mom, what can I have on the way out? Right. And I'm like, these two kids, like, what's going on? So you want to make sure that you're looking at their needs, their structure, not the parent being like, this is what you have to have, right? If there's a need, if there's an underfueling, of course, we will create structure. But I think working with them again to figure out what's going to accommodate them best would be good. So I love like dried fruit, applesauce, non-perishable fruits that aren't going to get bruised or ruined throughout the day. Do they like it cold? Do they like it room temperature? Check on a few of those things. Sliced up veggies can be really great too. Texture, carrots, cucumbers, bell peppers, those can be great. And then you want to look at other things that they also enjoy. Chocolate chips mixed with nuts, if you can take them to your school. Make your own trail mixes. Those can be really filling and fun and easy to do. You could even do, higher energy bars. I do like higher energy protein bars, but I snap them in half. So a kiddo gets a half of one of those. So it's not so you can get creative about what you send them with. And it can be a little charcuterie. It can be an assortment of snacks if it needs to be. That is all perfectly acceptable. But working together, some of those kind of high energy density fuel combinations with the trail mix, the nuts, the bars, those things. And then some of the fruits and veggies and textures can be really helpful for kiddos.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good point, particularly with the medication prior to breakfast before they take the medication, is a real good opportunity to get them on that schedule of we wake up, hopefully they'll start to be hungry. They eat a more caloric, more energy, laden meal at that time. And knowing that, by the time that you take the medication and it sets in, by lunch, they might have a little bit of a less of an appetite, and you can accommodate that. They get home from school, the medication is kind of shifting a little bit. They have a bigger snack and a bigger dinner. So you can, kind of shift the caloric needs at different times during the day. It doesn't have to be specifically balanced in that way. It can be, that's why I love working with dietitians, is they can shift things related to where they are in their activity level, their mood, and also availability, as well as, working with the medication.
In a related question, some caregivers say their kids eat when they're stressed or bored or feeling emotional. Some say their teens have an addiction to sugary foods. Others say their kids hide food or sneak it in their room. What are some recommendations to address the weak self-regulation skills that contribute to binge eating and how might parents help kids outwit these comfort food cravings brought on by emotional dysregulation?
Oh, this is a great question. And I'm going to just start it, but then I'm going to let Megan chime in, because I just want to say that this question following the last podcast was probably the biggest question. We got numerous related questions to this. So I'm understanding that our listeners and viewers are really, there's a lot of people who are struggling with this with their kids. So I'm glad that we're answering this. But, there's a clinical aspect to this, if you will, and obviously an emotional aspect to this. And there's the nutritional. And this is why the two, beautifully work together. I have working with some kiddos right now who say, I know I'm bored, and I know that I'm reaching for food for soothing, because let's face it, food does that for many of us, if not most. And it gives us that, even in boredom, that a pleasure, right? It gives us a way to regulate our emotions when we have difficulty. And so from an emotional standpoint, that's what I first do, is to recognize, okay, there's, 9, Megan? 9 types of hunger. 9 types of hunger that they've identified. And so it's really helping, the individual, the child, the parent, the adult, anyone, to kind of really sit and say, okay, what's going on right now? I just had a snack. I know I'm really not hungry, but what emotionally am I feeling? And this is a lot. This is a process that kiddos or even adults have to learn to check in with themselves of what they're truly feeling, as it relates to hunger, because there could be a lot of emotional things going on. And that's where I start as a psychologist, is emotionally, how do we identify those core emotions? How do I check in with my body and feel that? And sometimes the choice is going to be, I do want that, chocolate chip cookie because it does taste good and it makes me feel good. And I realize I'm not exactly hungry. That's okay. We can normalize eating in that way. But at least, what we're trying to do is be aware of our hunger fullness cues as it relates to emotions. And part of that process is learning how to check in with ourselves, identifying the emotion, and being able to, if it's out of boredom, being able to find other skills to regulate, other coping skills to regulate those emotions as opposed to turning to food. Megan, I'll let you kind of jump in there with that.
Wonderful. Okay, so everything that Dena is saying is hugely impactful in how we look at this behavior. I guess that's where I kind of want to start too. And I think that we can almost break this down into different aspects of that particular concern, right? Because there are those individuals who are doing these behaviors who are fixated and focused and, intentional, I guess is the word I would say, about what they want to eat and how much they want to eat and how they want that experience to go. Then there are those that are very unaware and disconnected from this behavior and need a lot of guidance around it. I think where we want to look at where is the concern is the frequency, sort of as Dena was indicating there. What is the frequency with which you're observing this behavior? Does this only happen on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the 2 days your kid gets to come home and not have sports and just relax and it's not that big of a deal, but boy, does it bug you, Or is this something happening with frequency? Are you regularly finding wrappers? Is there regularly being food that's hidden? Are these regular occurrences? And then you want to get into some of those whys. And when I think of the whys, we have to look at our food culture. A lot of kids are growing up in an environment where they don't know what foods they can or can't eat. Foods are available, but you shouldn't eat it. Foods are there, but don't have too much. And there's a lot of a language in how we talk about food. We use words like sugar and junk food and carbs. And I say that because they are loaded words. These aren't words that are just lightly used. And I know and I understand why parents and older generations like to use these terms, but unfortunately what that can do too is create dynamics around how food is done in the house that is part of that conflict. And so sometimes those intentional behaviors are because they know this is a disruptive behavior. They know this is something someone doesn't like, and maybe that's just not something that they care about. There's also a comfort that comes with processed foods. And I want to really recognize that because in the neurodiversity space of food, we villainize processed foods. And unfortunately, they are consistent foods. I mean, apples do taste different. You can have a good strawberry and a bad strawberry. You can have a perfect banana and a not so perfect banana, and so when we're dealing with choosing foods, sometimes the comfort doesn't come from being addicted to a certain type. It's knowing that you're going to get exactly what it is that you expect when you go for that food event. And that is comforting. It's like Starbucks. We don't just go in there and say, give me whatever you like. We go in there and we have a very clear and specific order. And no matter what Starbucks we go to, we know we're going to get exactly what we want. So when we talk about this process, we want to look at how often is it happening? Why is it happening? Who has a problem with it? And is it really a problem? Is this a bigger issue day to day, or is this a parental focus and it's something that can easily be worked on? And do they have awareness or don't they have awareness? Because building that awareness without shame, I think, is so important because we are so shameful of overeating and especially eating certain processed junk foods. And we need to move away from that because villainizing it isn't the solution either. It's a neutrality around it. This isn't the solution. And there's other things we can do instead.
Yes.
What about,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, what about the cravings for the sugar addiction, the cravings for sweets? It feels very real, and it can be very hard to control.
It is.
Absolutely.
What's the way to address that? Are there substitute foods for that?
Well, the truth of the matter is typically those cravings are because there is a deficit of some need in the body. So either we are constantly focusing on those foods or we have a deficit of need. So we don't allow ourselves to get the actual thing. So for instance, let's use like a great artificial sweetener, like a Splenda or a stevia or something that feels like maybe, I guess Splenda doesn't technically count as natural anymore, but something that feels more natural, even honey. If we move from artificial sweeteners, which our body doesn't know it is artificial, to get that craving of sugar to go away, our body hasn't received that craving cover. If we use something like honey or sugar or candy or whatever, those are our immediate fuel sources. That is what our body can use for our brain and our muscles as quickly as possible. So when I hear people regularly talking about the need for sweet foods, I think of a few things. One, there's a focus and a fixation on the fact that I like those foods. They meet my needs. They're the only ones that meet my needs. And we can work on that because lots of foods will meet your needs once we tone things down. And then the second thing that we want to look at is, what is the need for it? Is there a restriction? Is there a deprivation? Is there a villainization of those foods? Because it's like saying, don't think of a pink elephant, pink elephant, pink elephant, pink elephant, pink elephant, pink elephant. So for these kiddos, they're hearing in school, like my 8-year-old, almost 8-year-old on Saturday, I can't bring a dessert to his class because we can only bring toys now or a fun activity. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. I don't need another $1 plastic toy I bring in, whatever. Like, can they just have a cookie that day? No? Okay. So we have to be cautious about this villainization in our language and in the home environment. There can be a concern, but how we go about handling it in a non-shameful, balanced way is really what is going to determine the greater good outcome of this scenario.
Yes, I totally agree. I think one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking is that oftentimes the process, because there's a lot of interesting talk in the eating disorder field about sugar addiction. And we don't have to get into that, but the definite aspect of that is the process of seeking. So oftentimes, I know the question was about kids who sneak or kids who hide. And part of that is the whole dopamine response, right? So when I'm seeking something, I'm getting that dopamine response. And oftentimes it gives them, and if it is, especially if the food is villainized and they know I can't have it, and so they are rule breakers kind of anyway, part of that seeking may be related to that. And then once they get the food, oftentimes, not all the times, they may not even like it as much as they did the seeking or the hiding or the I'm going to show you. So that's why as a psychologist, I would leave Megan to, okay, let's figure out, nutritionally what you need. And as part of the underlying issue, I would kind of go to, okay, is this about frustration or anger or being told no or being, that I can't have that. So it makes it even more appealing. Those are some of the things that I would want to know. I have a little one, 10 years old, who was sneaking food. Mom would give her, it looked what it appeared to be a balanced snack. And then she would go and sneak some of the chocolate cereal. And so we looked at, okay, well, maybe we make that part of her snack, so that she feels like she has, kind of to her a balance. So then she doesn't feel like she needs to go and sneak. And it meets her needs. And again, we're looking at balance across, the day. And then what are the underlying, emotions related to that is leading them to that behavior. So it's an interesting and complicated process because even with the sneaking, if you will, the hiding, it gives them that dopamine relief and it becomes a reward system in their brain. And then it's connected to food. So it's a really interesting, we can't negate it. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Are there foods that you could substitute that still are sweet, but are better for you? So for example, if you are dealing with a sugar addiction and it feels like the cravings are intense, and maybe you could substitute fruit for a candy bar. Are there other kinds of things you might do to sort of quell that craving?
I mean, the difference between even the most beautiful, perfect peach, I'm like thinking of like the best, sweetest fruits, and a candy bar in a young adult's mind is a different experience than what we do as adults, right? And I'm going to throw my husband under the bus here. I talk to him like that all the time. I'm like, you're a 45-year-old logical male. You are talking to a 7-year-old. Like, he doesn't understand. And it's about food most of the time. And so what I would offer is a few different things. You can create guidelines in your home. My guideline is no same food twice in a day. So if you have your granola bar, that's your one granola bar. If you want a fruit snack, you have your one fruit snack. If you want your yogurt, you get your one yogurt. If you want your dessert, you get your one dessert, right? So it is, I don't like, they still have access to food. It's about seeing that there's a balance and a variation. And so what unfortunately can sometimes happen when we're trying to healthify too early in the phase of what these kids are going through is that it creates these new concerns and dynamics. And again, it makes it so that nothing's okay. And so when we throw our hands up, we go back to the Lay's potato chips that we've always known. And so I would say that when those really strong cravings come on, I would say, not only are you having a craving, but how hungry are you? Is this hunger or is this the need to satisfy something, right? Yes. And then where can we go from there? If it's not true hunger, if we ate an hour ago and we had a sufficient amount of food, is there a 10-minute activity we can go do together to distract and see where that craving is? If we come back, maybe we have that food. Maybe we have half that craving food and we sit down together and we mindfully enjoy it and we take it in and we say, is everything, like kind of Dena was saying, is it everything you thought it would be? Or is the fixation on the fact that you feel the need to have this to fix something, is that the process that you're going through? So I think what I would say is slow it down. Don't fear it. Get curious. Get curious instead of like, no, our parental response, which is fair and fine. We do this. If they say, Mom, one more time, I will literally, I don't know who, is going to end up okay after this. That was me last night. And so when we think about that with food, we get impatient and we get black or white, we get yes or no. And so instead, can we slow down and be curious? And you'll find everyone in that event will be more honest, will be more open, and will be more clear and willing to change.
Yes. And if you're out of balance, with anything, it's going to take a while to get yourself back in balance. If you're not moving your body, enough, you need to, maybe move your body in different ways. It's with anything. If you're out of balance, it's going to take a process, and especially with food. If their meal plan, if you will, it consists of a lot of high fat, high sugar processed foods, which there's a place, right? We can have balance with that. But if they're out of balance with that, it is going to take some time to shift. Let's integrate more fruits. Why? Well, because that gets us back in balance, and we can enjoy the pleasure of fruits as much as we can enjoy the pleasure of a fruit snack. So it's just a little bit of again, the language behind it is really important, and it does take time. And there will be, and particularly with those individuals, those with ADHD, they love that immediate gratification. There is impulsivity to consider, lack of consistency, right? Hallmark of ADHD. They get into the novelty of something and then they get off of it. And so all of that is some of the beautiful strengths, right? They get interested in so many different things, but it's also a struggle to keep them consistent and doing the same thing, which is why we have to change things up a lot, right? If and that's with the meal plan a lot, especially with the meal plan. They've got to have some diversity and understanding that that's going to be inconsistent, which could be the consistency within their life. It's a struggle. I certainly understand it, particularly, my kiddo, oh my gosh, with his food. I've shared this last time, he was on Vyvanse and wouldn't have an appetite. And he goes, Mom, you don't know how it feels when you don't have an appetite and you need to eat. And I said, I understand. I feel for you. I feel for you so much. So let's figure out what we can do different so that you can get something in you, and don't wait literally all day until 4 o'clock to eat, all your energy. So, and then we would do something and then he would get off, because he has ADHD and that's what he does. And then we would have to figure out and kind of introduce something else as ideas.
Okay. One mom asked, when my daughter, who's a tween, starts to severely restrict her food and calorie intake because she says she wants to lose weight fast, what are helpful ways to intervene? She doesn't believe that healthy eating and regular exercise work fast enough to get her to her goal.
I mean, first of all, weight loss as a tween is never medically indicated. And the next thing that I do, one, I would seriously suggest bringing a dietitian on at this point and saying, cool, if you're going to do that, guess what? You're going to go work with an expert, because TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook can't be, your moderator. And we find most of the time, I know a lot in the previous conversation, you guys talked about social media, but most of the information that they gain on doing it faster comes from those spaces. And those aren't fully honest spaces, especially when there is the degree of, success, air quote, that we typically see in those testimonials. So one, as a tween, we don't need to be losing weight. This is especially for females, where we have our long-term bone development, where we are having hormone regulation and menstrual cycle regulation, where we have so much overall development occurring, that to do even healthful eating and, intensive exercise for weight loss would probably not even be a healthful activity. So when I think about having this conversation, the next part is, when is it going to be enough? Right? If we're a teenager and we're already in this space of wanting to change and control our body to a certain degree, when are you going to let your body change? When are you going to let it become an adult body, whether you're a male or a female? And I find a lot of times there is this struggle in that tween phase to be fearful of that female body, right? That womanly body that's going to be more filled out, that's not going to be as narrow and, thin ideal fitting within our society and our culture. And I'm not saying that's always an influence, but it does kind of go along with what's going on here when we hear the restriction and the exercise. We have to catch it as soon as possible. And we need to provide education in the bigger picture, because this is work all of us do as individuals, whether we do it as tweens or whether we do it as a 20-year-old or whether we do it as a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old. And it's coming to terms with the control we have over our body, our size, and our weight. And when we allow that in teenagers, we are giving them misgivings on how controllable this is in the long term. And it can create a really damaging fixation for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, it's a great point, Megan, because it's not pretty severe. It is severe. I just want to remind everyone that eating disorders, have the second highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness. Only second in the last recent years to opioid overdose. So it's one every 62 minutes somebody dies of an eating disorder. So I'm not saying that to scare people, but I'm saying that to be aware that if I hear a teen is starting to severely restrict to lose weight fast, I mean, that can do so much damage to, their heart, to their metabolism, to their bone density. And it's really severe issue. And so we really want to, like Megan said, provide education and understand that, you want to lose the weight for whatever reason, because there's an emotional reason there. And that's what I kind of would dig, what is that about for you? Usually it's about self-esteem, low self-worth. They've been wounded somehow emotionally, and they want that attention. And again, the appearance ideal. How can I look and at least get some accolades for my thinness, if you will. And it's really dangerous. It's a dangerous behavior. I had a 17-year-old that we identified already. She's 17, already having osteoporosis. I mean, we understood she'd been restricting since she was 12 years old. And so It's a real serious issue, and we need to grab it by the, horns, and parents say, nope, we're not doing this. We're not going to be doing this because it's dangerous.
Well, on a related note, another mom asked, when my child who has anorexia is having a particularly difficult day, I work with her to search for foods she can tolerate. What else can I do to support her on those days? And how do I help challenge those thoughts that make her believe she should restrict food? So it's even a little more severe than the previous question.
Sure. That's a hard one because first of all, I feel, for all the parents that are, just, the compassion goes out to you all for, working, because it's hard enough to raise children and teens. And it's another thing to have someone, who has a struggle with an eating disorder, disordered eating. That being said, and Megan, I'm going to let her really chime in because it's really going to be down to, we have to have a consistency in the meal plan, and, working with a psychologist, a therapist to deal with those harder days and develop coping skills outside of the eating disorder is going to be really important. But what I would put forward is to say, I know you're having a tough day and we have to eat our meal plan anyway. That's really key, because what happens is this eating disorder, if you give it an inch, it will take a mile. And then you see the spiraling down. And so when we try to accommodate, I don't want to get too fixed, right? Black and white thinking or, too rigid. But when we do try to accommodate and give them foods that they can eat, then we get into when will it be enough? Like, right? What am I trying to say, Megan? Like, you do that too much, and then we're really compromising their energy needs. And we begin to almost collude with the eating disorder thoughts. So it's very complicated. Like, yes, we want to look at the thoughts and how are they influencing, particularly probably body image issues too. But we also want to be aware that, despite their thoughts, we need to eat a balanced meal plan that has been subscribed or prescribed by their dietitian. I'll let you jump in, Megan.
I want to do a little assumption with this one, and I want to use that they have anorexia nervosa, because that's telling me that hopefully they have support on their side, and they're not just saying, hey, I know my child is struggling and I'm working on it the best I can. Because even as Dena was giving those great examples, sometime as the dietitian, I say, the best thing you can do is only ask questions in this way, and this way. And we talk about that. The love that a parent has is not enough to overcome the self-talk that's going on for this eating disorder. You're never going to be able to support it away. And so while your best instinct as an excellent parent is to be there all the time, you need to be there. You need to ask open-ended questions. Is there anything I can do to support you right now? Is there anything I can do to help you because I see you struggling? These open-ended questions that don't back them into a corner. And while they love you so much, you may not be the best support for them. So the team is working on who are the other family members they can reach out to, who are good friends that are supports to them. How can they learn how to cope with this? And as Dena also mentioned, there's a plan in place. I work really clearly on, here are the expectations of eating. The client says yes. I say yes. Parents are notified and get on board, but the parents aren't always solely responsible, depending on the age, the struggle, and all of that, because we don't want to create more conflict in the family dynamic around food. That is not the goal. And so there's clear goals, and then there might be clear consequences or results that happen if we have continued struggles. So showing up, being there, reporting the struggles you're observing, and continuing to be a loving parent is sometimes the best way to support a child who is struggling.
Another writer or another listener asks, my son and several boys we know with eating disorders feel shame around having what they think of as a girl's disease. What can I do to help my son?
I mean, it's 25% of the overall eating disorder diagnosis rate, which is already up from 15% that was 4 years ago. So I think we can offer cool old school mentality. You guys are the new wave of individuals getting help, right? Like, I mean, I guess I would just not play into the shame. This is not a gender specific disease. This is not an age specific disease. We used to even say it was a young female disease, right? And that's not even the case. It's not even just young females. And we know that this impacts the gay and the LGBTQ and the trans community. Like, they're so impacted by eating disorders and struggles as well. So I guess I would just say, embrace the fact that that is an old school mentality and to get rid of that shame so that they feel more open to get help.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say exactly, like, shame can really be a barrier to overcoming. And sometimes it's real. Don't get me wrong. I definitely think we should identify it and understand it. And there is stigma out there, right? How boys should look. And, particularly related to body image issues, there's a significant relationship between the relationship with their father in terms of health and how that impacts their view on health. And we do see a risk factor that if there is struggles in the family with health, particularly with the father, there may be an impact on the young boy as it relates to eating issues. So there is that is known. But Megan's right. Like, the stigma, I mean, we have to work around that and advocate and have our children advocate that, just like everybody wants to be inclusive, we're working on inclusive and diversity, and belonging is the same with eating disorders. Like, it does not discriminate.
So how might a parent identify eating disorders in young males versus females? Does it look different? And then the subsequent question is, are there therapists and nutritionists who really understand eating disorders in males? Is that an issue to find someone who's familiar with this?
I mean, I would offer that this, I started working with males, I think it was in 2009, because most treatment centers were female, everyone's treatment center name, female, women's, and when we started doing it, I was like, well, what's the difference? And I would offer that the differences are there. There's a language difference. Men talk about food and engage in food and have social dynamics around food in a very different way, especially in teenage years, to challenge a guy to like, oh, I bet you can't take out a large pizza, that might not be the end of the world, unless this kid's like, doing it for money all the time or having health, but girls would never sit around and likely kind of do that challenge. It's just not what we would do. It's like crying over boys watching The Notebook and like eating snack foods maybe, right? So I guess what I'm saying is the dynamics around all of that stuff will be very different in that they also may talk about it differently. A girl may identify with the term purging, where you would use the word like, have you ever made yourself throw up? Or have you ever vomited with a male? Purging may not be something they relate to. So there are differences, but I would offer that the disease, the motivation, the shame, the past behaviors, the influence, they are all very similar. And so as you start working in this space, and you start working with both males and females, I would offer supervision and learning more about some of the uniquenesses of male eating disorder stuff. But I would say that food shows up about the same. There's a food apathy, there's a food aversion, there's a food discourse that we kind of write off a little bit easier in males than we might in a female. And that's something to keep an eye on. Dena, I don't know if the stats on this, but I feel like RFED or avoidant, restrictive, picky eating is higher in males to a certain degree, right? So you may notice it a little bit differently there. And boys might not always be as emotionally willing to share and talk about things as quickly as some females might. But other than having some patience and just being attentive to gender differences that might show up, really, it's the same things. It's mood, it's behaviors around food, it's a change in attitude, it's highs and lows. It's the same things that you would be on alert for as a parent.
Yes. And one thing I wanted to add is, we're always looking at growth charts. So to answer your question about professionals, yes. First of all, the key would be to get a professional that is certified in eating disorder as a specialist, but also obviously trained and understands eating disorders. That's the first step. And then to understand what Megan just said about those differences with those males. One thing I want to note is that I do spend a lot more time with families if their young boy has a eating disorder. I feel like I do a lot more education, and understanding and providing that those tools to help their son, because I do find there may be a stigma with the parents of possibly invalidating or not truly understanding, that eating disorders can happen with boys and can look very similar. And it doesn't mean anything about their will or their, commitment or their, strength or anything to do about their character. It really is a mental health issue.
Mm-hmm. This question came in from an educator. I teach middle school health, and I'm particularly interested in any do's or don'ts when teaching nutrition to all students that would be sensitive to those battling an eating disorder.
Ugh. Don't do it. I know. Okay. So first of all, the ones that are out there that are, considered quality are not quality. I want to offer the CDC has some, a lot of school districts pull from some of our, larger government programs that are out there. And I want to say that health classes aren't necessarily a problem in the eating disorder space, but they definitely have an impact in the eating disorder space. And a health class done wrong or with personal influence from that educator, which I think happens way too often, can be detrimentally impactful. Yeah. I actually had a client get the health class removed from her high school after she struggled with a severe eating disorder. And I had nothing to do with it, but she said, these are not qualified educators. They are promoting their own agendas. And this was damaging to my health and it no longer exists there. I also want to offer that the way we educate on food in general in our culture is very villainizing. So, to go in and to say less white rice and more brown rice, if you have a bunch of people from Asian cultures or Hispanic cultures or cultures where white rice is a very normal staple, what do they do with that? And so I guess I want to offer in health class basic nutrition education without villainization of foods, and with cultural education around foods could be the best way to go. Don't talk about weight. Don't talk about any, personal indicators, because there's really just no need. And they're probably not fully qualified to educate on that, because we now know how impactful that information is at such a young age when it isn't done in a way that's fully sensitive to all the needs of the kid in the class. And I want to offer, that sounds complicated. It is not hard to do. No. We just don't do it very well. Like we could come up with this in the eating disorder educator space. No problem. It's not impossible. It's just so much of a difference from what we talk about in the normal ways of nutrition and food education.
Right. And I want to take a few seconds here or minutes just to talk about, I have met an amazing colleague who has started actually a curriculum. She has a curriculum called Be Real. It's BeRealUSA.com and it's .org. BeRealUSA.org. And she's developed a curriculum for educators, for teachers to talk about this in the school, and certainly for kids. So it's a beautiful nonprofit program, and just so excited to be an ambassador in that, because I feel it's important. And it's sometimes the impact on setting these messages that can provide weight stigma and be harmful that we don't even know. For example, I have a lot of adolescents that I work with who say in choir class, when I'm trying on my uniform, my dress, they do it in front of everybody and they take measurements. and it's shameful. It's embarrassing. When I'm in my fashion class and the teacher told me to stand in front of a mirror and say, what kind of figure, is it hourglass? Is it, apple? Is it these kinds of exercises or assignments are just very harmful. And we need to be aware of, first of all, they're teenagers and they're incredibly self-conscious. But we also need to be aware of our practices with our kids, the way we message food, the way we talk about diets, the way we talk about ourselves. We need to be very careful. Their ears and our children are listening, and we do not want to degrade or use language that is self-deprecating or prejudice in any way.
Our last question, do you have suggestions for preparing a teen who has an eating disorder and will be leaving for college next year to eat healthfully?
First of all, leaving and knowing they have an eating disorder, they should have a team wherever they're going. So if there is any concern about dysfunctional eating, not even qualified, eating disorder diagnosis necessary behaviors, I just want to offer that big transitions in life don't make our eating behaviors better often. They do tend to make them worse, right? And so it's not, we villainize things like the freshman 15. That's a transitional way for our bodies to go through things, and it creates panic and horror and, terror in all kinds of ways. And instead, who's a team that can be available for them for support, dietitian and therapist? Is there a community that they can start immediately setting themselves up with? I would be careful about the healthfulness because, to be honest, kids in college don't eat, and they don't eat very regularly. I'm an educator at Arizona State, and when I talk to my students, I'm like, what are you doing, you poor thing? And it's busyness, it's access to funds, it's access to quality, enjoyable food. And so I guess my redirect there would be healthful is eating. It's consistent. And it whether it's from Chick-fil-A on campus on a more regular basis, or whether it's from the dining hall where they have more of a cafeteria style, they don't have it as a freshman going off to college, a kitchen typically. So we have to be really careful about our expectations of what healthful eating can really look like for a new college student. I find sophomores, juniors, seniors are in apartments and they can be more intentional and they can cook more and they have more time and they get it. I guess I would offer support, be curious, and help them along the way is what I would offer.
And expectations about health, right? I'm paying for your college, even if they're on a full scholarship. I'm sure there's something, I'm providing this as a privilege. And your responsibility is to take care of your health. So how can we support you in that, and certainly be involved in that? So a lot of, many of my college students, I will have sign an authorization so that I can update the parent just to say, hey, I don't tell them, I don't break confidentiality or tell them all the nitty gritty, but I just say they're coming, they're on track, we're in a good place, or there's a situation here. So be involved and have expectations. Like, this is a contingency. You taking care of your health is contingent on you going to school. And so that's something that I think is really important.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Dena and Megan, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your expertise with our community. To everyone listening, thank you for joining us. The replay of today's conversation will be available on attitudemag.com. We'll email everyone who is registered once the recording is up. Thank you so much.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's attudemag.com.